I stood in the doorway of the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Miller Global, the logistics empire my father had built from a single truck. At the head of the table sat Mark, my stepbrother, wearing my father's favorite Rolex and a smirk that cost more than my car. Beside him was Diane, his mother, the woman who had swooped into my father's life 2 years ago and effectively erased me from it. "Leo?" Mark's voice was slick, like oil on a wet road. "I thought you were still in London, finding yourself. You're a bit late for the meeting. Actually, you're about 6 months late for the funeral." The board members, men who had once bounced me on their knees, looked away, their eyes fixed on their expensive pens. They had already been bought. Diane didn't even look up from her tablet. "The security protocol has changed, Leo. You don't have a badge anymore. Please leave before we have to make this unpleasant." I didn't move. I looked at the nameplate on the desk. Miller, CEO. My father's name had been polished off the brass. I had spent the last year working in the shadows, tracking every penny that left this company while I was supposedly away. They thought I was the weak, artistic son who couldn't handle the real world. They thought I was a ghost. "I'm not here for a badge, Diane," I said, my voice low and steady. "And I'm not here for a seat at this table." Mark laughed, leaning back. "Good, because there isn't one. The new bylaws were signed and notarized last month. Miller Global is now a subsidiary of Diane's holding company. You're a civilian now, Leo, a guest, and guests aren't allowed in the inner sanctum." I pulled a small silver flash drive from my pocket and set it on the table. It looked like a toy compared to their high-tech gear. "I'm not a guest," I said, looking Mark directly in the eyes. "I'm the landlord, and your lease just expired." Mark's smirk flickered. He signaled to the 2 heavy-set security guards by the door. "Get him out of here. He's trespassing." As the guards grabbed my arms, I didn't fight. I just looked at the chairman of the board. "Check the envelope I sent to your private residence this morning, Mr. Gable. Before you let them throw me out, ask yourself why the signature on the merger papers has a 3-degree slant that my father never had." The guards paused. Mr. Gable's face turned a ghostly shade of white. "To understand how I got here, you have to understand the day they broke me. 6 months ago, I stood at my father's graveside. It was raining, a cliché, but the cold was real. I had flown in from London, my heart shattered, expecting to grieve with family. Instead, I found a business transaction." "Leo, honey," Diane said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy as she adjusted her black veil. "Your father was so worried about your stability, he left a small trust for you. It's enough for a modest apartment, but the company, he knew you weren't built for the stress. He left it to Mark. He wanted it in capable hands." Mark hadn't even waited for the dirt to settle. He was already on his phone, barking orders to the CFO. When I tried to speak to the family lawyer, I was told he was no longer representing the estate and had been replaced by a firm Diane had hired. Within 48 hours, the locks on my father's estate were changed. My childhood bedroom was packed into boxes and left on the curb. I was told my allowance was being suspended due to liquidity issues. "You're just a passenger, Leo," Mark told me as he stood on the porch of the house I grew up in. "Some people are born to drive the truck, and some are just cargo. You're just excess weight. Go back to your sketches and your museums. Leave the heavy lifting to the men." I stood on the sidewalk, my father's old leather satchel over my shoulder, watching them toast with champagne through the window. They thought they had stripped me of everything. They thought because I didn't scream or fight, I was defeated. What they didn't know was that my father, a man who survived 3 recessions, never trusted anyone. Completely, not even the woman he married. In that satchel was a hidden compartment, and inside that compartment was a key to a safe deposit box Diane didn't know existed. I didn't go back to London. I went to a basement apartment in the city, bought 3 monitors, and began the long process of digital archaeology. If they wanted to play dirty, I would show them that I had learned from the best. I spent 4 months silent, 4 months being nobody, until I found the first crack in their glass castle. A series of offshore transfers dated 3 days before my father died. The betrayal wasn't just about the money. It was the method. As I sat in my dimly lit apartment, I watched the digital trail. Diane hadn't just married my father, she had systematically isolated him. She had replaced his longtime doctor, his accountant, and finally his lawyer.
The new will they produced after the funeral was a masterpiece of legal deception. It cited a mental decline my father supposedly suffered in his final months, a decline no one had seen. It gave Mark 60% of the voting shares and Diane the rest. I was left with a 2% non-voting stake in a sabbatical fund that required Diane's approval for every withdrawal. "It's for your own good, Leo," she had emailed me when I questioned the document. "We don't want you squandering your father's legacy on artistic pursuits." But I was looking at the company's internal ledger, something I had accessed using my father's old emergency credentials that Mark had been too arrogant to change. Mark was bleeding the company dry. He was selling off Miller Global's assets, the warehouses, the fleet, the land, to a shell company called Apex Holdings. And who owned Apex Holdings? A secret trust registered in the Cayman Islands. I spent 18 hours a day cross-referencing IP addresses and bank routing numbers. It was a shell game, a classic corporate strip mine. They weren't just taking the company, they were destroying it so there would be nothing left for me to reclaim even if I tried. But they made one fatal mistake. They assumed I was just like my father, honest to a fault. They didn't realize that watching them had taught me how to be a predator. I found the trigger incident. On the night of October 14th, while my father was in a drug-induced coma, a notary had supposedly visited his hospital room to sign the transfer of the primary deed. I tracked down the notary, a man named Miller, no relation, who had suddenly moved to a villa in Spain 2 weeks after the funeral. I didn't call the police, not yet. I needed the board. I needed the public. I needed to wait until they were at their most arrogant, the moment they were about to sign the final merger that would make Apex Holdings the sole owner of the Miller legacy. The crisis hit when I received a cease and desist from Diane's lawyers. They had found out I was digging. They threatened to sue me for corporate espionage and freeze my trust fund entirely. "You have nothing," the letter read. "Stay away or we will bury you." I smiled as I read it. They were finally scared. The pressure became suffocating. 2 days after the cease and desist, my landlord told me I had to move out. Someone had bought the building and was renovating. My bank accounts were flagged for suspicious activity and frozen. Even my old car was towed for unpaid tickets I knew I didn't have. They were trying to starve me out. I was sitting in a 24-hour diner, my laptop tethered to a burner phone, when a black sedan pulled up outside. A man in a sharp suit walked in, someone I recognized. It was Arthur Vance, the lawyer Diane had fired the day my father died. "They're coming for you, Leo," Vance said, sitting across from me. He looked tired. "They've got the DA's office looking into unauthorized access to Miller Global servers. Mark is telling everyone you've had a mental breakdown since the funeral. If you don't leave the city tonight, they'll have you committed for an evaluation." "Let him try," I said, not looking up at my screen. "Leo, listen to me," Vance leaned in. "I've known your father for 30 years. He was smart, but he was outmatched by Diane. She's a professional. This isn't her first time doing this. She's purged the records. The original will is gone. The hospital footage from the night he signed the deed, erased." I finally looked up. "Nothing is ever truly erased, Arthur. You taught me that when I was 10. You said every contract has a ghost." Vance sighed. "The board meeting is tomorrow. Once they vote to merge with Apex, it's over. The assets will be moved, the company liquidated, and Miller Global will cease to exist. You'll be fighting a ghost for the rest of your life." "Then it's a good thing I'm a ghost too," I replied. I showed him the screen. I had finally cracked the encryption on the Cayman Trust. I hadn't just found the owners, I had found the source of the initial funding. Vance's eyes widened. "Is that Miller Global's pension fund?" Mark didn't just steal the company, he stole the retirement of every driver and warehouse worker who worked for my father for 40 years. He's not just a thief, he's a parasite. "You can't just walk in there with this," Vance warned. "They'll destroy the evidence before you can speak." "I'm not walking in just with a laptop," I said, reaching into my satchel and pulling out a heavy wax-sealed envelope. "I'm walking in with the one thing Diane forgot my father possessed, a sense of humor." The morning of the board meeting, the city was draped in fog. I didn't dress like a CEO. I wore a simple black hoodie and jeans. I walked past the protesters outside. The drivers who had heard rumors that their pensions were in jeopardy. They didn't recognize me. To them, I was just another kid on the street. Inside, as the security guards tried to haul me out of the boardroom, I saw Mr. Gable open the envelope I had sent him. The room went silent. Mark noticed the change in atmosphere. Gable? What is that? Ignore him. He's a disgruntled former relative. Let's proceed with the vote. Mr. Gable, a man who had been the company's moral compass for decades, looked at me, then at the document in his hand. He ignored Mark. Leo, where did you get this? It's the ghost clause, Mr. Gable, I said, shaking off the guard's grip. Section 14, paragraph C of the original founding charter. My father and you wrote it in 1994, remember? Diane stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. There are no clauses in the charter that override the current majority ownership. Mark owns 60%. The vote is a formality. The charter states, I said, my voice cutting through the tension, in the event of a merger with an outside entity, the voting power of all shares is suspended until a forensic integrity audit is performed by a neutral third party, if requested by a direct blood heir. Mark laughed. An audit? Audit what? We've had clean books for years. Not an audit of the money, Mark, I said, stepping closer to the table. An audit of the blood. I looked at Diane. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. My father had a rare blood condition, hemochromatosis. It's hereditary. Every 6 months he had to have blood drawn. The records at the hospital show his iron levels were perfectly normal the week he died. Mark scoffed. So, he was getting treatment. No, I said, he wasn't, because the man in that hospital bed, the one who signed the deed transfer and the new will, he didn't have the condition. I have the lab results from the night of the signing. I spent 3 months tracking down the nurse who took that secret sample. She was paid to stay quiet, but she kept a backup. I looked at the chairman. The man who signed those papers wasn't my father. It was a stand-in, a double. The room erupted. This is insane, Mark screamed over the shouting board members. He's making up conspiracy theories. Security, get him out now. But the guards didn't move. They were looking at Mr. Gable. Wait, Diane said, her voice strangely calm. She looked at me with a terrifying coldness. Even if the signature is questioned, Leo, I am still the legal widow. Under state law, without a valid will, the estate reverts to me. Mark is my son. We still hold the keys. You're just proving that your father was too sick to sign his own name. I waited for the noise to die down. This was the moment, the twist they never saw coming. You're right, Diane, I said. The widow inherits everything, but there's a problem with that. I pulled a second document from my satchel, a certified copy from a small courthouse in Nevada. You married my father in a private ceremony in Vegas 2 years ago, but you forgot one small detail from your past. Your divorce from your first husband, the man in Florida, it was never finalized. The clerk's office lost the filing in a flood, and you never checked. I turned to the board. Under the law, her marriage to my father was bigamous. It's void. She was never his wife. She has no legal claim to his estate, his shares, or this company. The silence this time was deafening. Diane sank back into her chair, her face draining of all color. Mark looked from his mother to me, his bravado crumbling. That doesn't matter. I'm still his son. I'm his legal heir. Are you, Mark? I asked softly. I reached into the envelope and pulled out a DNA test result. I did some digging into your birth certificate too, and the private clinic where you were born. My father always suspected, but he loved my mother too much to look. But you aren't a Miller, Mark. My father had a vasectomy years before you were born. He told me that in a letter he left in his safe deposit box. You're lying! Mark lunged across the table at me, but the security guards, the ones he had hired, intercepted him. They didn't work for him anymore. They worked for the man who was about to pay their salaries. I'm not lying. And the best part? I've already filed the injunction. The court has frozen all Apex Holdings assets as of 10 minutes ago. But then, Mark did something I didn't expect. He started to laugh. You think you won, Leo? You think the documents matter? Look at the screen. He pointed to the large monitor on the wall. A live news feed showed Miller Global's main warehouse, the heart of the company, engulfed in flames. If I can't have it, no one can. I've already wiped the servers, the evidence, the history, the legacy. It's all burning.
The boardroom watched in horror as the flames licked the sky on the monitor. "You're a monster," Mr. Gable whispered. "I'm a businessman," Mark shouted, his eyes wild. "You want to take my company? Fine. Take the ashes. The insurance is in my name. The payout goes to a private account you can't touch. By the time the fire department puts that out, I'll be halfway to a country with no extradition." He turned to me, a jagged grin on his face. "You were always too slow, Leo. You spent months looking for papers, while I was preparing for the end. You have your truth, but I have the money." He grabbed his briefcase and signaled to Diane. "Let's go, Mom. Let the air rule over the graveyard." I didn't move. I didn't even look at the screen. "Mark," I said, my voice echoing in the panicked room, "do you remember what I told you? I'm the landlord." Mark paused at the door. "What is that supposed to mean?" "The warehouse you're watching burn? That's not Miller Global's main facility. I bought the neighboring lot 3 months ago through a proxy. I moved the entire inventory, the servers, and the archives last night. Every driver, every clerk, every worker, they all knew. They helped me." Mark looked back at the screen. He peered closer at the footage. The building burning had a different logo on the side, a defunct textile mill that had been empty for years. "I leaked the secret location of the new servers to your assistant yesterday. I knew you'd try to destroy the evidence. You didn't just commit arson, Mark. You committed arson on a property owned by the federal government. They were using it for storage." At that moment, the boardroom doors swung open. But it wasn't more security. It was 4 men in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back. "Mr. Miller, Diane Miller, you're under arrest for arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, and embezzlement of pension funds." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Diane finally broke. She started screaming at Mark, blaming him for everything. Mark just stared at me, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. How did you do all this without anyone seeing?" "Because you spent all your time looking at the throne. You forgot to look at the man standing in the shadow." The courtroom was packed 3 weeks later. It wasn't a trial yet, just a preliminary hearing to freeze the assets and return control of Miller Global to its rightful state. Diane sat in a jumpsuit, her designer clothes replaced by orange cotton. Mark refused to look at anyone. The prosecution played the recording I had made. It wasn't a secret bug or a hidden wire. It was a simple recording from my father's old bedside clock, the one Diane thought was broken. "Just sign it, Richard. Leo doesn't care about you. He hasn't called in months. Mark is the son you always wanted. Sign the paper and the pain goes away." I won't," my father's voice, weak and raspy, followed. Leo knows the truth. The ghost, he'll find it." The sound of a struggle followed, then silence. The judge looked at the medical examiner's report. "It says here the cause of death was listed as natural causes, but the toxicology report you've provided, Mr. Miller. It was a slow-acting sedative, Your Honor, just enough to make him confused, just enough to make him compliant. When he refused to sign, they increased the dose. It wasn't murder in the traditional sense. It was an execution by increments."
The judge turned to Diana's lawyer. "Does your client have any response to the fact that she was never legally married to the deceased?" The lawyer stayed silent. It was no defense for the truth. The courtroom felt heavy with the weight of the betrayal, but for the first time in 6 months, I felt like I could breathe. I looked at the gallery. The front 3 rows were filled with Miller Global drivers. They weren't there for the drama. They were there to see if their futures were safe. I stepped forward and handed the final folder to the bailiff. "This is the restoration of the pension fund," I told the judge. "I've tracked the Apex Holdings transfers. Every cent has been recovered from the offshore accounts. I'm requesting that the court immediately appoint Mr. Arthur Vance as the trustee to ensure these men and women get what they earned." A cheer broke out from the drivers, a sound that shook the walls of the courtroom. But I wasn't finished. There was one last piece of the puzzle, one last secret my father had kept, not from me, but for me.
"Wait!" Diane's lawyer shouted as the judge was about to adjourn. "Even if the second will is fraudulent, the original will from 2010 still stands. That will leaves 40% to my client. The bigamy charge is a civil matter. It doesn't automatically negate her status as a beneficiary named in a previous document." The room went quiet. He was right. In the eyes of the law, even if she wasn't his wife, the old will still named her. Mark looked up, a glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. "That's right, the 2010 will. You can't throw that out. I still get my share." I looked at Arthur Vance. He nodded. "The 2010 will is indeed valid," I said to the judge. "And in that will, my father left 40% of the company to my wife, Diane Miller." "Exactly!" Diane cried out. "However," I continued, pulling a small yellowed piece of paper from my pocket, "there is a codicil, a secret amendment my father filed with Mr. Vance years ago, to be opened only if he died under suspicious circumstances." I read the words aloud. "To Diane, I leave exactly what she brought into this marriage. If it is found that she has acted with malice toward my blood or my business, her share shall be redirected in its entirety to the Miller Global Employees Scholarship Fund." I looked at Diane. "You knew. You knew who you were from the beginning. He just wanted to believe he was wrong. He gave you a chance to be a part of the family, and you chose to be a vulture." The judge looked at the document, verified the signature, and banged his gavel. "The 2010 will is upheld, with the codicil. Diane and Mark Miller receive nothing. Leo Miller is declared the sole executor and majority owner of Miller Global." The guards led them away. As Mark passed me, he spat on the floor. "You think you're a big man now? You're just a lonely kid in a big office. You'll fail just like he did." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. As the courtroom cleared, Mr. Gable approached me. "So, what now, CEO? We have a lot of work to do. The merger is dead, but the company is bruised." "I'm not the CEO, Mr. Gable," I said. I looked at the drivers waiting for me in the hallway. "I'm going to do what my father should have done years ago. I'm turning Miller Global into a worker-owned cooperative. I'm taking my share and going back to London to finish my degree. I'm done with the shadows." 1 month later, I stood in my father's old office. The mahogany desk was gone, replaced by a modern, open-plan space. The nameplate on the door didn't say CEO, it said Community Hub. I looked out the window at the fleet of trucks, all newly painted with the logo of the Miller Cooperative. My father's legacy wasn't a building or a bank account. It was the people who kept the wheels turning. I had one final task. I drove out to the cemetery. The rain had stopped, and the sun was setting over the hills. I sat by my father's headstone and pulled out a small old phone, his phone. I played the last message he had ever recorded, a file I had found hidden in a system folder labeled Drafts. "Leo," the voice was tired but warm. "If you're hearing this, it means you found the ghost. I'm sorry I didn't have the strength to fight them myself. I was old and I was tired, but I knew you had the fire. I knew that if I left you a path, you'd follow it. Don't let the business change you. Be the man who looks for the truth, not the man who looks for the profit.
I love you, son." I wiped a tear from my eye and set the phone down on the grass. Diane and Mark were facing 20 years in state prison. The shell companies were being dismantled. The money was back where it belonged. They thought they could steal a man's life by changing a few signatures. They thought they could erase a son by locking a door. But karma doesn't need a key. It doesn't need a badge. It just needs someone to stay quiet, stay smart, and wait for the right moment to speak. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter than I ever had. I was no longer the underestimated son. I was the man who finished the story. They called me nobody until the judge read my name.